Welcome to General Quarters. Today we are pleased to have with us author George Neumayr. George, welcome and thanks for taking the time to be here.
Sure, thanks for having me.
But first, a few points. If you like what we are talking about here, please pass this video along to friends and families. We're living in strange times. We're fairly certain our message has been subject to shadow banning. And please hit the subscribe button, then the like button and the bell to be kept informed as to new content. Lastly, before we get started, it's important to point out we only exist because of strong, faithful Catholics like you who support us. So if you can afford it, please consider a donation to lepantoin.org/donate. That's lepantoin.org/donate. With that, let's get at it. First, some background about my friend, Mr. Neumayr here. George Neumayr is the author of 3 books. The Political Pope. He is co-author of No Higher Power, Obama's War on Religious Freedom. George has served as executive editor of the American Spectator and Catholic World Report. He's op-ed editor of Investors Business Daily, which, by the way, I've read for many years in my career, and media fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Neumayr has written on politics and religion for the Washington Times, the Daily Caller, the National Review Online, Human Events, the Washington Examiner, The Hill, and The Guardian. Today, we're going to discuss Mr. Neumayr's 3rd book, The Biden Deception, Moderate, Opportunist, or the Democrats' Crypto Socials. Now, George, the reason this is so interesting to me is you published this book months before the election, and your observations and admonitions were right on the money and very prescient. But first, before we get started, I would like to ask you this question. Frankly, I get heat for this sometimes, but ill-informed people who can and should, they tell you that you should separate politics from religion. I think it's patently absurd. Can you briefly first talk about the Catholic mandate to incorporate our faith into all decisions, not just political ones? In other words, would you agree we have an obligation as Catholics to guide our voting decisions and just to be informed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, God is obviously relevant to politics because God is the determiner of what is good for human beings. And politics aims at securing that good of human beings. So in order for politics to be practiced responsibly and truthfully, it has to have a relationship to the God who determines what is good for human beings. Otherwise, politics becomes something that is unrelated to the good of human beings. So, it becomes a kind of Tower of Babel style project. So, if you separate God from politics, you're separating God from what is good for human beings, and you're not consulting God's will in determining laws. And if you're not consulting God's law in determining laws, then the law is going to end up becoming something very corrupting and unjust. And so we can't simply surrender the field of politics to the secularists. We can't just allow them to dominate politics, because if they dominate politics, then the law will have absolutely nothing to do with God and what he intended for human beings. So that's the philosophical reason for why God and politics can never be separated. And so, in order to understand what is actually just and good for human beings, you have to consult God, because he's the one who determined the good for human beings. So, and we've seen in recent decades, the more godless politics becomes, the more corrupting it becomes, the more unjust it becomes, the more evils that it sanctions. And so that's really the fundamental philosophical reason why Catholics can never or must apply God's will to politics. We can't pursue a godless politics, because if we do so, our politics will end up corrupting human beings rather than serving their actual good.
Right. Well, that's very well stated. And in last century, we have the bodies of over 100 million people as testimony to that.
Right.
And I just one more observation before we jump into it, because I've often felt that in the course of my own personal philosophy, we are obliged to form our consciences correctly. Natural law is primary, number one. And number two is faith and reason together is
Right.
what made Western civilization what it is. And the minute you separate the two, with faith and reason, faith on its own leads to fundamentalism, and I can think sometimes, sometimes of terrorist organizations in Islam, and reason separated leads to utilitarianism and nihilism. We
Right.
have an obligation to really, drill down on this. But anyway, thank you for that. So it's important to context, to offer this context.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how, in the West you have quote unquote reason without faith, and then in the East you have quote unquote faith without reason. But they both produce irrationalities. The irrationality of the West is seen in this very corrupting secularism and increasingly insane secularism. We're seeing that with transgenderism and all that stuff.
Yes.
We're seeing how secularism, this quote unquote reason without faith, it ends up denying the most basic common sense realities, such as biological sex. So that's the irrationality we see in the West, and then in the Islamic East we see the irrationality of this jihadism and turning to violence. So they both kind of, in the West you have the violence of abortion, in the East you have the violence of jihadism. So yeah, as you're saying, faith and reason have to be joined together. If there's a rupture between them, then it produces irrationality and violence.
Yeah, well said. And I can't underline that enough before we even start this conversation, because I often find that argument absurd. That you keep your morality and religion out of my politics. Well, in the first place, as you just eloquently stated, where does all laws, good laws, come from? And they come from our relationship with God and the mandates that God that makes demands of us. And when we mess with that, well, we can obviously see, as again you pointed out, the jihadists on one side and the secular on the other, and this is where we're at. And so I think, again, a very important point to bring up. So moving on to the Biden deception, you laid out the following that we can expect from the Biden presidency. And, I thought this was great, George, because this book came out, in September or August prior to the election?
I believe it was September of last year. Yeah.
Yeah. And right before the election. And this is what you predicted. A Biden presidency would, one, undercut law and order. It would erase our national borders, insist on abortion on demand across the country, repeal the Trump tax cuts, treat communist China as an ally rather than a dangerous foe, pick up where Obama left off in remaking America, but far more aggressively, be the stepping stone to power for an even more leftist Democratic Party, right? This list is not comprehensive. You go on and on, but can you please talk about that? Because you nailed it. Everything your premise in this book was literally a roadmap to where we are today. Go ahead.
Right. I was hoping to offer a warning to Americans that a Biden presidency, would mean the completion, basically, of that project that Obama started. He said he wanted to transform America fundamentally.
Yes.
And I saw, a Biden presidency as really, it would combine the worst of the Obama years with the worst of the new radicalism in the Democratic Party, and that would all translate into this ruinous project of trying to transform the country fundamentally. So, the Biden presidency is it's like this third term of the Obama presidency, but it's actually a little more radical than even Obama's terms, and it's aiming at transforming the country in a fundamental way, which basically means, as we've been discussing, removing the natural moral law completely from our politics, yes. and also creating a new political order, which has nothing to do with the founding principles of the country. It's becoming clearer and clearer that Obama's and Biden's America has absolutely nothing to do with the America of the founding fathers. It's an America that is basically a socialist and secularist dystopia, which is completely alien to the Judeo-Christian foundations of the country.
Wow, well said. If we could just to tick off a few of them, erase our national borders. I think this is, in my view, this is the most pernicious element of their policy, because it's, to me, it's such an overt power grab. And if you could discuss it, but what I mean is, they want to let in as many illegal aliens, particularly from the southern border, because who's kidding who? Who are they voting for? If I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, the largest gap, or rather landslide victory in American presidential politics, was between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. I think it was 20 million votes or something. And I have heard that number bandied about, because the concept was, we're just going to let these people in to make sure we secure power, because you know who they're voting for. I mean, can you talk about that one? Because I view that one as, I'm a little shocked that there isn't more, people waking up to this obvious fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair observation, that for the Democrats, illegal immigration is a way of increasing their voter base. They see, all these illegal immigrants, who are coming in. They think if they receive amnesty, which is, the hope of the Democrats, that amnesty will be extended to millions and millions of illegal immigrants. They just assume that all of those new Americans would vote for the Democratic Party. So I think it's fair to say that, for the Democrats, illegal immigration is a source of easy votes, and then for the corporate Republican types, illegal immigration is a source of cheap labor.
Bingo.
And so I think, the both parties have motivations for allowing this, this de facto open border situation to continue. And I think but the point, of course, is that, as Trump pointed out, you can't have a nation without a secure border. So if you're going to have a sovereign nation, a nation that truly belongs to the American people, the border has to be secure. You can't have an open border. The American people have a right to determine who comes into their country, and if they don't have that right, then in what sense can those people be called sovereign? And so really that's, this fundamentally transformed America, Biden's, it eliminates one of the most fundamental requirements of a nation being a nation.
Well, I got to say, you said something, George, a second ago that I do not hear often, and it was frankly refreshing. The Republicans are not lily white on this either. They have, they've kind of subtly have turned their back on things like illegal immigration for years, because it is a form of cheap labor. And I think in the interest of fairness, we have to apply like sound moral principles to both sides of the aisle. And I think that I don't hear that very often. So thank you for making that point. A couple other things that you listed. Repealing the Trump tax cuts. I mean, there was one of them, but the one thing, actually, I'll forget about that for just a moment. But the one thing that really gets me, I find fascinating, is when Trump was in office, we actually exported energy. We exported oil. This guy gets in, shuts down the Keystone pipeline, if I'm not mistaken, the Patriot pipeline as well, right? Shuts these down. Fracking has been kneecapped, right? We got all this stuff going on. And now, okay, as the pumps, $1 a gallon rise, or whatever the exact number is, now he's going hat in hand to our enemies and going, could you produce more oil? I mean, it's laughable. Do you know what I mean? And these are jobs that were destroyed. And again, please comment on that, because that's just one of the things that I kind of just find enraging.
Right. And that's just another, it's really another attack on the independence of the American people. Just as the open border situation, that sort of makes it impossible for the American people to control their own country. Similarly, the environmental policies of Joe Biden, which seek to kind of give international bodies like the UN more power over energy policy than the American people have, that also is really an attack on the sovereignty of the people, and it's making America less independent, more dependent on these bodies outside of the United States, countries outside of the United States. And I think Joe Biden's overall project is really to weaken and undermine the independence and sovereignty of the American people. And I think he's doing that on both the immigration front and with respect to his environmentalism.
Great point, Steve. You lead to another question that I don't believe we discussed earlier, but before we got on, but I suspect you'll have some very strong opinions. I find the union or correlation with the Holy Father kind of striking. What you just said is, okay, we have Joseph Biden, our president. He has pulled some of these moves to, let's say, for example, actually hurt America. We no longer have independence in terms of energy when it comes to oil, and now he's bowing to the UN. He goes to the G7 summit and says America's back. And then we have the Holy Father on the other side, who actually, if I'm not mistaken, borrowed Build Back Better from Biden.
Right. Yeah.
As Catholics, a good Catholic should obey the UN. That's true. He said that. I remember because I was floored when he actually said that about a year and a half ago or something like that, maybe a year ago. And what I'm saying is, what do you see as the correlation here? Because the average person, this is how this gets by a lot of people, right? This is a personal opinion. The average person does not really want to go that deep on this. And I see this as incredibly moving towards this vision of a utopian one world kind of thing.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? Because I know people think I'm nuts, but
Yeah. I mean, Joe Biden is clearly, he's choosing elitism over populism. So he would rather have decisions made by an international elite than by the American people. And so one of the first things he did when he entered office was to reestablish America's support, or the American government's support for the Paris Climate Accords.
Perfect example. Paris Climate Accord. What person in their right mind who had America's interest in mind would be a member of that? That's insane.
Right. So that was determined not by the American people, but by a cabal of environmentalists at the United Nations. And Trump refused to uphold it because he could see that it was so clearly a threat to the sovereignty of the United States and to the economy of the United States, and that it gave advantages to China and Russia and all these countries, these polluting countries, which have absolutely had no intention of following it. It just was a way to empower those countries at the expense of the United States.
Nor are they required to, George. That's what's fascinating.
Yeah, right.
Please continue. You're making some.
So I think the fundamental, problem, or the reason we should be so concerned about that trend in that direction of the Biden administration is that it's really taking America out of the hands of the American people and putting it into the hands of this liberal international elite. So if we want to remain a free country, if we want to have control over our own country, we have to oppose that internationalist move that Biden is making. And he wants us to sign on to all these UN treaties, which clearly are not designed to benefit the United States. And most of these treaties are really based on false moral philosophy, based on a rejection of the natural moral law. And there's always some pro-abortion element to these treaties, or some transgender element. So we have to oppose this, because if we don't, we're going to end up, the United States could end up being an appendage of the United Nations.
Yeah, and I think, which leads to my next point in our discussion, because I happen to think that that's the goal, to be an appendage of the United Nations, or some derivation of that. But again, in your book, and you make this point effectively, all elections, particularly presidential ones, are incredibly important. But 2020 was arguably one of the most important in history. And you frame this up as a seminal moment in the United States, where the United States becomes a socialist state modeled on lockdown America, or renews its commitment to freedom and capitalism. And I don't think that's overstated. Talk about that a little bit, because it really is that binary and severe. look at where we are versus 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's really it was a choice between, do we remain faithful to the American Revolution, or are we going to become, are we going to follow the French Revolution? That's I think we're kind of under Biden, we're seeing America is less and less faithful to the American Revolution, and it's more and more akin to the European tyranny that the French Revolution initiated. And so we're becoming much more like a socialist or secularist European country than a country that is faithful to the principles of capitalism and freedom that were established by the founding fathers. And so I think that's another way of putting it is it's really a choice between freedom and tyranny.
Yes.
Are we going to remain free, or will we allow these secularists and socialists to tyrannize us and to take our freedom away and tell us and determine for us what is good for us, even though their conception of the good has absolutely no relationship to God, who determines the good. And this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, that the conception of the good has to be rooted in God's will, not man's will. So God has to be the measure of that, not man. But the whole tyranny that Biden envisions is based on man's will, not God's will. And that's really the difference. That's one of the major differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution recognized that rights come not from government, but from God, whereas the French Revolution said that rights come merely from government, and they excluded God from politics, and that's so really we're going back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is are we going to have a godly politics or a godless politics? That's really the question. So by voting for Biden, unfortunately, we've chosen a godless politics, and now we're reaping the consequences of that.
Well said. And you were bringing up the French Revolution. I think was a very central point. When you look at it, and these are, again, to your credit, George, a lot of people aren't talking about this stuff because I think sometimes in America we're a little provincial and we don't really pay attention to history or what goes on around the world. The French Revolution is a perfect example. What happened there? The Reign of Terror. They purposely went after the church, destroyed the church, and the whole concept was going forward was a Freemasonic tome, if you will. Egalitarianism, fraternity, and liberty. I'm sorry, free, right?
Right. Fraternity, liberty, and equality. Yeah.
Right. And so equality, which is a very, very often misunderstood and frankly, terrifyingly misunderstood concept. It's not equality of opportunity; it's equality of outcome. And that was the thing. And the French Revolution was fundamentally Freemasonic, right? It was get God out of religion. This is the church's eldest daughter at that point turned its back on the church. Notre Dame, right, was a great silo with the goddess of liberty, a scandal declared woman defiling the altar of one of the most magnificent churches in Western civilization. And these are things, and that was not by accident. And what we're seeing is, and as you just pointed out, where was French Revolution 1789 or something, or is that right? Whatever, the late 1700s. Forgive me, but the late 1700s, and we're 200 and something years later, and this is still playing out. And what it is this ties into Our Lady of Fatima and the admonitions there. It's a Freemasonic move, kill God, get him out of government, and we see the ramifications of this everywhere.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? And I think the last election, and to your point, is this going to be lockdown America, or are we going to renew our commitment to capitalism? I guess I would ask you, because if I could ask you, and not so much for a prediction, maybe for a comment, because I have my doubts. I have my doubts if we're too far down the road, because human nature as it is will always take the path of least resistance, circus and bread, So can you comment on that? What's your prediction, if you will?
Well, I think, the direction, or I think the end sort of game of the Biden crowd is, they do want a state that is thoroughly secularized, that is merely a reflection of the willfulness of kind of human beings. And we've seen with liberalism that willfulness can take all sorts of contradictory forms. Politics ends up becoming whatever the liberals in power want at any given moment. And that's just another way of saying that your state has become tyrannical.
Yes.
So I think, like, all these specific policies that we're seeing from Biden, they issue not from any kind of philosophy grounded in reality or grounded in God, who determines reality. It's all based on the caprice of whoever's in power, and that's why I think that this new tyranny in the name of public health is it's so bewildering, because really we're at the mercy of these people who the willfulness of those in power, and we're not seeing any there's no coherence to their policies, because it's not flowing from any principles grounded in reality. It's not grounded in common sense. It's not grounded in the way in which God organized reality. It's simply based on the willfulness of the liberals in power. And occasionally, they might adopt a policy that is commonsensical, but then the very next day they might suspend it. So really, once you've removed politics from any kind of philosophy grounded in reality, then really you're just at the mercy of the willfulness of those in power.
Right.
Yeah.
The power grab. I'd like to get on that path a little
So that's,
bit.
I think that's why, to go back to the beginning point you made, is that, the if you make the error of separating God from politics, then you're in effect, you've already accepted the premise of tyranny. You've already kind of accepted tyranny once you've made that separation, because politics from that point on is never going to have anything to do with the reality and the way in which God organized it. It's simply going to be a reflection of the desires and will of whoever's in power, and that will have nothing to do. And more often than not, that's going to have absolutely nothing to do with the actual good of human beings. Right. And that's, so the definition of a tyranny is, those who are exercising power over us are not doing so for our own good, but for their perceived own good. And that's what we're going through right now.
Well said, George. Honestly, if I could, correct me if I'm wrong here, for context of anyone who's listening. Right, in the past, the model has always been, in human history, the strong subjugated the weak. Right, man was good. Then, Judeo-Christian principles entered into the picture. Man had value. We have to, and as that sort of evolved over the centuries, we have the greatest civilization, Western civilization. Here's my point. Evil and Freemasonic principles have learned that no longer is it required for the strong to subjugate the weak, because you can do it easily. Okay, and I get the sense over having listened to you about the recent pandemic that has been that has inflicted us. Which, let's face it, there are people who are very, very ill, but the way this was handled was for anyone paying attention was kind of laughable. And here's my point. I think that evil, and it goes back to your point to the French Revolution, again, to give people context in history. There was a real Freemasonic movement there, where we're going to separate faith and reason, right? And the elite will rule the world, and everyone will get in line. And this is not conspiracy theory. I can back this up. So we have these governments who were, in my view, prior to, let's say, the cerveza disease, prior to that, the current approach was climate change. The world is going to change. You have to hand over your rights, and this presented a tremendous opportunity, and no one is questioning them. Do you think I'm off base here? And my premise is really simple. There are a small percentage of elite people, mostly hanging around Davos at the World Economic Forum, who really want to have a utopian view of the world, which, by the way, includes reducing our population from 7 to 1 billion of
Right.
perfect people. And so again, to talk about the opening premise of what we started with, I think there's a lot of validity to what I'm saying. Do you agree with me, or can you speak to that?
Yeah. No, I think that I think the consequence of separating religion from politics is that government ends up acting like God.
Yes.
So so either you have God in politics, or you take God out of politics, and then government becomes God. And then those in power rule over you as if they're gods. And so that's really, I mean, the in order to keep government limited, government has to recognize a power above itself.
Yes.
But if it doesn't recognize a power above itself, it will tyrannize its citizens. And I think that the secularism, the secularism paves the way for socialism. It paves the way for an overreaching,
Right.
limitless government that seeks to control every aspect of your life. And the Faucis and the Bidens, they're all, these are, their fundamental philosophy, political and moral philosophy, is thoroughly secular, and and consequently they don't recognize any limitations on government activity.
Wow, well said. And I love what you just said about secularism leads to these totalitarian regimes, or certainly, an atheism. But I was thinking to myself, we have all of this going on with guys like Fauci and the World Economic Forum and et cetera. I just think that historically speaking, man cannot help himself but to ally himself with power plays of taking and controlling people, taking and controlling resources, right? And I think evolutionary, there's a sort of an argument to be made that man has generally on survival followed the alpha animal. And so my point really comes down to this: we've thrown out God, right? As Aquinas said, we have to fill that God-shaped hole. Well, what are we filling it with? It's things like pure theater, like wearing a mask. It's things like the woke movement, the transgender movement. All of these things now become religious in their fervor.
Yeah.
You follow
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's a mess, because like to transition a little bit. This is what I want to say. I lost my place a little bit, but you talked in the book about the Second Amendment, right? And I'd like to get down this path a little bit. Okay, and it was just proven a few days ago with Biden's embarrassing handling of Afghanistan, which is beyond my comprehension of how bad that was. I mean, it was awful. What is the first thing the Taliban did when they got to a town and got in? Hand over your guns. You don't need them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Did it in Venezuela. They certainly did it in Cuba. They did it, obviously North Korea. You pick a country, that's what they're going to do. And we're watching this, right? In the new model, we've seen it done in Australia. We've seen it done, obviously, in the UK, where no one's noticing that in Australia, since they did that, murders are up 25%. By the way, can you comment on that, George?
Yeah, I mean, Biden is really an explicit opponent of the Second Amendment. I would say he's trying to destroy it by 1,000 cuts. He can't eliminate it altogether, without the support of the Supreme Court. I mean, and he's obviously trying to change the Supreme Court. He's proposed court packing. He wants more Supreme Court justices, and he's obviously putting liberal activists on the federal courts. So I think he is hoping that judges one day will, through judicial activism, uproot the Second Amendment completely. But so far that hasn't happened, and so his room to maneuver is somewhat limited. But he is trying, I think, through all these confiscation plans, that Kamala Harris has talked about and Biden has talked about. They are trying to
Oh no, George, they're not
eliminate people's
they're
right to self-defense.
They're not confiscating, George. They're buying them back.
Oh, right, yeah. But I think the overall or the overarching philosophy that Biden has, which is that the Bill of Rights are not absolute. He said, the rights in the Bill of Rights are not absolute. That kind of that tells you a lot, just right there. It shows that he really doesn't think that rights are God given. So he's willing to say that the right to self-defense is not absolute, in effect. And so that just shows you that he thinks rights come not from God but from government. And if he understood, that God is the source of our rights, then I think he would approach this issue in a much more restrained manner. And so I think, just as he doesn't believe in a right to biological life, he supports abortion. Given that, why should he support a right to self-defense, which presupposes a right to life? So all of this is, I think, connected philosophically.
Cool. Yes.
So people who don't, secularists who don't support the First Amendment, they tend not to support the Second Amendment, and they don't tend to support the other other rights in the Bill of Rights, because again, for them, for their philosophy of rights is not rooted in God; it's rooted in their own willfulness.
Well said, and in their own philosophy, which was a result of reason only. And we all know we can reason our way to anything we want. In our final segment,
and we've learned that reason, in quotes, because it really deserves to be in quotes, because it's not. It bears no relationship to the faculty of reason that God placed in human beings. So reason ends up being just a synonym for willfulness. And that's what we've seen over the last, since the Enlightenment, basically, is that rationalism actually is, rationalism is irrational. It just ends up being something very willful, and it's not based on the order that God established in creation. It has nothing to do with God, the creation of God. It's it's simply based on willful concepts, or willfulness and concepts in the mind, which actually bear no relationship to the way in which God organized reality. And we've seen, and that's most graphically illustrated by this transgenderism movement that they're pushing so aggressively.
oh,
What could be more irrational than saying that a biological man is a woman? That's and they're the ones who always say, "Oh, we're the party of science." Well, the party of science is able to look at a biological woman and say that woman is a man, and it's the party of science is willing to stare at a sonogram and say that's not a human life.
Thank you.
So obviously, the party of science and so-called reason, it's unscientific and irrational.
Great points. To wrap it up, forgive me, I just had a thought. It seems to me that the left has garnered this kind of power by a very skillful kind of hijacking of the narrative of community organizing under the Saul Alinsky banner, right? In other words, the entire premise, every idea they put forth is put forth in the idea of the community, and this is great for people, and they did it very skillfully. They even managed to take murdering babies and make it a good thing. I mean, it boggles my mind. I was thinking as you were talking, I was listening to you intently, the way out of this, right? If there is a way out of this, because I don't know if America has the resolve. I pray we do, right? A reverse Saul Alinsky, in the sense of very much understanding that from a community level, we've got to fight this fight, whether that be, excuse me, the school board in particular, your local elections, and really defend this. Or one thing that got me, and I'm certainly not a constitutional expert, but as I understand, the sheriff is always the premier law enforcement officer in most counties. Working with that guy to elect him, which, by the way, interesting, he's elected, and making sure that we defend our rights and those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that? I just kind of basically thought about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, we do need a resurgence of common sense in our politics, and that's only going to come from dedicated, committed citizens who are willing to stand up to the government when it behaves tyrannically. We have to remember that the American Constitution is based on the premise that man does not belong to the state. The state belongs to man.
Yes.
So the government is an extension of it's government of, by, and for the people. It's not government of, by, and for these petty tyrants and bureaucrats and internationalists. So we have a government that is subject to our control, and we have to remember that, because a lot of the people in authority are misusing that authority, and yet they think they can impose that on us, and they certain habits of docility make it possible for them to pull off that scam. But we have to remember that the government belongs to us, that it's our government. It's not owned and operated by this Leviathan at the federal level. So we have to take our own government back from these tyrannical bureaucrats and politicians and internationalists.
Well said, George, honestly. And actually, to be perfectly candid, what terrifies me is, I don't want to say willful blindness, I want to say the lack of education as to what makes American exceptionalism, what the value of the United States. You talk, and I see you nodding, and I think you will agree with me. You talk to, quote, your average citizen. They have absolutely no idea about the beauty of the Constitution, the checks and balances, the reason for the Second Amendment, right? The fact that you just stated so eloquently, the government is owned by us. Our rights come from not them, God himself.
Yeah.
These principles, so basic, I would argue, are lost on the population. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen, is that those in power try to propagandize us into surrendering our freedoms, and they want us to bow to their will, even when their will is so completely at odds with what the government or what the Constitution prescribes. And so yeah, I think that we are being, as the term of art now is gaslit. There's gaslighting that's always going on by the Bidens. They're trying to convince us to give up our freedoms, and we shouldn't go along with that. We should demand that our constitutional rights be respected and recognized. The Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers said that the American people have the right to remake their government the moment it turns tyrannical. And so I think I think we've actually passed that point. What the federal government is doing to us now is actually probably worse than what the British government did to the American colonists. And so we have every right, to demand that our constitutional rights be recognized.
Wow, George, I'll probably leave it there. Like I said, it was a real honor to have you. You offered some real insights, and we went on a track there that we weren't counting on. And I hope we started one way, and it all started from the premise beginning in the show when we talked about faith and reason and God.
Yeah,
and it kind of naturally flowed. But I can't thank you enough, George. I really enjoyed it.
Sure.
In closing, just want to say a few more things. Lastly, one more time, it's important to point out we only exist because of strong Catholics like you who support us. So if you're so inclined, lepantoin.org/donate. lepantoin.org/donate. If you can afford it and you like our content, please consider a donation now. Or the second way is, if you're looking for a great gift for someone, please visit our store at lepantocatholicgifts.com. We have a beautiful Sacred Heart cross there. Michael Hitchborn designed it. It's solid silver, not hollow. Frankly, it's beautiful. Michael Hitchborn designed it, and he fully credits the inspiration to Our Lady. And we're selling this as a sacramental. And we strongly urge you to get this blessed. It's a magnificent gift for every occasion. And with that, we say goodbye to my good friend, Mr. George Neumayr, who I have enjoyed several cigars with, by the way. And the company I very much enjoy. George, thank you so much to being with us today.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. God bless you.
God bless you. All right, and this is General Quarters at the Lepanto Institute. We're saying goodbye to Mr. George Neumayr, and thanks you guys. Until next time, Viva Cristo Rey. Bye-bye.